So in this session, we are going to talk about batch apex, and we are going to talk about different aspects of batch apex. Before we start talking about batch apex, let's quickly have a look at what all we are going to discuss here. We'll start with discussing about the underlying concepts of batch apex, try and understand what is batch apex, where it is used, etc. We'll talk about the syntax and the structure of batch apex. We'll talk about what are the different methods which are used within the batch apex. We'll talk about the execute batch and schedule batch methods, which are used for putting the batch jobs into the job queue. We will try and understand about defining the scope of batch apex. There are two ways of doing that. One is using Database.QueryLocator. The other one is Iterable. We'll talk about both. We'll talk about how do we use callouts in batch apex. Then we'll also talk about using state in batch apex. We'll try and understand what is stateful batch apex, and how do we use that. And then we will discuss about some key limitations in batch apex. All right. So this is what we are going to cover in this session. However, just to ensure that this session does not get very long, we would keep things in this session to these topics. In future sessions, we will do the demos of different types of execution of batch apex. We'll discuss about interview questions related to batch apex, what sort of questions you can get and how do you answer those, and some real life use cases of batch apex. So that's something which we will cover in some of our future sessions. But as part of this particular session, this is what we are going to, in a nutshell, cover and discuss. So this is going to help you build very solid concepts around batch apex, how those are used, and how those are executed in real life. So starting with the batch apex, the core concept of it, let's try and understand. So before we start getting into what is batch apex and all that stuff, let's understand the core concept of batch. What is batch, and why do we bring batch into why do we basically bring batch into the picture in any other or in a generic scenario as well? So not specific to Salesforce. Let's try and understand. So for understanding this, let's take this small scenario. So let's say I have this set of people. So there are say 100 people who need to go from this location to this location. All right, and all that they have is this one car. All right, and what I have say 200 people here, and this car can accommodate only 5 people. All right. Now, just think of this practical situation. What would be an ideal approach to handle this situation? Will it be a good solution to ask all 200 people to get onto this car, knowing that the capacity of the car is only 5 and it will not be able to take 200 people at once? That will not be the right approach, correct? So what is the other alternate to that? The other alternate is this entire 200 should be split into batches of 5, right? And then maybe this car has to do 40 trips to ensure that all these people reach from their source to destination one by one in batches, right? That is the concept. Now, why do we need these batches? If I talk about this particular scenario, why are we even requiring this? The purpose is that I have some limited capacity with the resources I have. My resource available is just the car, and it has got a limited capacity. Okay, now I cannot overload my resource with something which it is not capable of handling, and that is where I brought in the concept of batch. Same thing applies within Salesforce concept also. You have limitations on how many records you can process at once in one transaction, etc. However, you will have requirements where you will have to deal with more records or bigger chunks of data. In that case, what you would do, you would bring in the concept of the batch apex. So batch apex is basically concept of breaking the bigger chunk of data into smaller manageable batches, which can be then executed, right? So that way you are respecting the limits as well, and at the same time you are able to achieve your objective of processing huge chunk of data as well, right? So that's what a batch apex usually does. So what are we doing with batch apex in Salesforce? So it is an apex code which is written, which operates in small batches of records. Okay, so you can process big chunk of data. However, the code that you would write will automatically process the records in smaller batches, and batch by batch it is going to process the data. Okay, breaks the processing down to manageable chunks. So instead of handling the big chunk of data, it will basically break the overall scope of records into manageable chunks. Uses apex Salesforce provided Database.Batchable. So pretty much similar to other asynchronous apex, like we have seen the queuable, schedulable. Batch apex uses Database.Batchable interface. So that is the interface which is implemented to define batch apex. All right, and Yeah, you can have only 5 queued or active batch jobs at one point of time. So Salesforce, of course, because batch apex is handling big chunks of data, Salesforce has a limit on how many batch jobs can be running concurrently in Salesforce, and that is 5. All right, so that's about understanding what is batch apex. Now quickly let's understand what are the methods. So if we talk about other asynchronous apex like queuable and schedulable, in those classes you used to define one method, which was the execute method. However, in case of batch apex, you will have 3 methods inside the batch apex. So when you define a class, so it's pretty similar to the structure. Overall is going to be pretty similar. You will define a class, you will implement the Database.Batchable interface in that, right? However, in case of one execute method, now in this batch apex, we will have 3 methods defined inside the batch apex. All right, the first method is the start method. Now start method is responsible for collecting the records or defining the scope of records. So if I have to process 50,000 records, start method is what is the method which will collect all those 50,000 records, and then the processing will start happening batch by batch. So the actual processing of record will happen in the execute method. So actual processing happens in the execute method, pretty similar to the queuable apex or a schedulable apex, right? So execute method is the one which will get executed multiple times. Start method will execute once. Execute method will get executed multiple times because it is going to get executed in batches. And then the finish method. The finish method is basically used for doing anything which will be, for executing any code which you want to execute at the end of all batch executions, right? So if there are 50 batches, once all 50 batches have got executed, so start method will run once. Let's say there are 50 batches to be executed, this will run 50 times. Now about how many batches, batch size, etc., that's, we can define that as well. We will discuss about that in a while. So let's say there are 50 batches getting executed, so this will get executed 50 times, and then finish method will again get executed once after all the 50 batch after all the 50 batches have got executed, right? So that is the thing. So in finish method, you can do something like, maybe, if you have to send an email out to someone to inform all batches have got executed, or if you have to initiate some other method, or if you have to call some other method, etc., those can be done using finish methods. Now finish method, while you have to define all these 3 methods, start method, execute method, of course there has to be some code in that. Finish method, if you do not have anything to do as part of the finish method, you can keep it blank also. But even if you want to keep it blank, you still have to define that finish method. This finish method will be required. Now looking at the syntax is quite simple, similar to what we had in our queuable or schedulable apex. But the only difference is that here we are dealing with 3 methods. So this is the first method, this is the second method, and this is the third method. This is the finish method. The last one is the finish method. As I said, if you have any code to be executed after all the batches are processed, then you can use the finish method. Otherwise you can just leave it blank, that's also fine. Start method will collect all the records which are to be processed, okay? And then there are 2 ways of doing that. One is using Database.QueryLocator, and the other one is iterable. I'm going to come to that in a while. And then there is execute method. Now execute method basically works with the start method. So execute method will get the data from the start method, and then it will process it in batches, right? So if there are, say, 50,000 records to to be processed, execute method, if I want the batch size to be 2000, then it will execute 2000 into 25. So that is how it's going to get executed. So the execute method will get executed 25 times here. All right. So this is the overall syntax, and important thing, this uses the Database.Batchable interface that we have defined for making it batch apex. All right. So this is the syntax, simple, straightforward syntax. Now the next thing that we are going to quickly look into is how do we put, so once you have defined a batch apex, how would you put that batch apex into the job queue? So if there is a batch apex, you will have to put that into the job queue. So put that into the job queue. There is this method, Database.ExecuteBatch. Database.ExecuteBatch method, it's predefined Salesforce method. This is used for putting a batch apex into the job queue, right? And like any other asynchronous apex job, it returns an ID, and this ID this ID can be retrieved from this object, async apex job, right? So if you want to check the status, etc., for that particular job, Okay, every time a job is put into the job queue, it will have a unique ID, job ID or batch ID. And you can always write a query on async apex job. So async apex job is where all these jobs are stored, and using the ID you can retrieve the status, etc., or if there are any errors you can retrieve those using this query, right? Now the next thing will be about understanding the scope of, or defining the scope of batch job, right? So now this is important. So what we are going to do is, here while we are writing the start, execute, finish method, we need to define the overall scope of the batch job, right? So scope of my batch job will be all the records which need to be processed, right? So this is the scope of batch job, right? Now usually what will happen, there can be two scenarios. Before we start understanding what are the ways, let's understand two scenarios. Okay, so one scenario can be your scope. Defining the scope is pretty simple, and you can define your scope using a query. All right, straightforward logic. You can define it using a query, SOQL query, right? So this is fine. This can be one approach. The other approach is that your scope, defining your scope is not that simple. You will have to, you cannot simply go and write a query. You will have to basically do certain things, or it is not that structured scope that you are using. So that is another possibility, right? So your scope is a little more complex and cannot be defined using SOQL query. So here, let's say SOQL query, straightforward SOQL query is not working. You will have to do a little more in terms of defining the scope, right? So for these two scenarios, so first of all, we will need to understand this in this particular aspect, that can I go and define my scope very clearly, straightforward? Is it just, writing a query like retrieve all the accounts which were created in last 30 days, something like that? So that is straightforward. But if my scope is a little more complex and it is not something which can be retrieved using the queries, then it falls into the second scenario. Okay, so now if you have a straightforward query available to define your scope, then you will be using Database.QueryLocator for defining your Database.QueryLocator for defining your scope for the batch apex, right? And where do you define the scope? You define the scope in the start method, right? So in the start method, you will use Database.QueryLocator. Now, what does Database.QueryLocator do? It works with a method called Database.getQueryLocator, and it takes a query as a parameter. So it will basically, this Database.getQueryLocator method will take the query as a parameter, and overall set of records which are returned by that query will become the scope of this execution, right? Now, so this is the straightforward process. However, if we do not have that option of defining the scope with a straightforward query, if my scope is slightly more complex, then Salesforce provides another way of defining the scope, which is called iterable. And this is a very, very important concept, or very important question that keeps on coming very frequently in your interviews also. Most of the cases, I think 90-95% of the times, you will be able to manage with the Database.QueryLocator. You will be there will be very rare scenarios where you are actually working with iterables, but knowing this concept, understanding this concept is going to be very important from an interview perspective also, right? So if it is not very straightforward, if I have custom, complex, or non-standard set of records which I am trying to work with, then I, instead of Database.QueryLocator, I use iterable in the start method, right? And this iterable, again, the concept is that you will be able to you will not just be working with a query, you will be able to put your own logics, etc., formulate the data the way you want, and that will become the scope of your execution here. All right, so that is the thing. That's how it works. Okay, so that's about defining the scope of batch job. So there are two ways, as I said, Database.QueryLocator and using the iterable. I'm going to do demo for both of these later on for us to understand it in details. Now, so while we spoke about Database.execute batch method, which can put the batch job into the job queue. However, there is one more thing which is called system.schedule batch. There is one more method actually. Now, what does the system.schedule batch method do? System.schedule batch method will schedule the batch job once only with some time delay, right? And this time delay is to be provided in minutes. Okay, so for example, in this scenario, there is this method system.schedule_batch, all right, and there's a parameter that you define here. You can define your time delay there, right? So now what will happen? This method will put this batch job into the job queue with a delay of 60 minutes, and this is just going to be one time thing. If you want to schedule something regularly, let's say every Friday or every 1 hour or every day, something like that, then we will have to use the scheduler, which is used in schedulable Apex. But here it is basically just a one-time execution that you're doing with a delay. So you can schedule with a time interval delay, and that time interval that you're supplying is actually going to be in minutes, right? So that's about the system.schedule batch. Coming to the callouts. So callouts are basically, when you are actually making a call to an external system, right? So these are basically HTTP request or web service methods defined with web service keywords, etc., right? So if you are trying to make callouts by default, you cannot make callouts for using batch Apex. In case you have to make callouts, then what you need to do, in addition to the Database.Batchable interface, you will have to use one more interface here, which is Database.allow callouts. So if you have to make callouts from your batch Apex, then you will have to specify this Database.allow callouts interface that will let you make callouts through your batch Apex. Now, the other important thing in batch Apex is understanding state in batch Apex. State in batch Apex basically refers to the overall state of the batch job, right? So you usually call it that the batch Apex is stateless. What does it mean? Let's understand. So there's this concept that each execute method, each batch that is being processed in the batch Apex is a discrete transaction. All right, discrete transaction means a new transaction of Apex code. So what happens usually? Let's understand this. So if let's say there is a batch Apex that you have written, right, and this batch gets executed 10 times, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this way, so it gets executed 10 times, right? So first execution is a discrete transaction, and the second one is also a discrete transaction. Basically what does it mean? That the first execution, when it happens, it does not carry forward any information for the second one other than the records which are to be processed, right? So each execute method is a discrete transaction, right? So it gets executed, all that information is again reset, and then the second execution starts, right? So that is the thing. So in this case, what happens? So first method got executed, all the information was reset, again the second method got executed, things were reset, etc., right? Now in this kind of a scenario, by default your batch Apex works like this, right? However, in this kind of a scenario, let's say at the end of all executions, I want to get a count of how many records were processed total across all batches, and I want to send out a notification or email to someone that, okay, fine, this entire batch job got executed and these many records got executed. Now for me to keep account of that, how many records, I need to have a variable which can have its value stored across all batches without being reset after each batch, right? So if there were 5 here, and if there are 5 here, my requirement is that I don't want this value to get reset. If it is 5 here, then it should become 10 here, then 15, then 20, then 25, right? So, but the default behavior is this, okay? And that's why I am saying that, batch Apex is usually stateless. It does not store the overall state of the batch, right? Of the batch job, right? It only works on the execution as a discrete transaction of that particular execute, right? If you want this to happen, if your requirement is this, then what you can do, you can define one more interface here, database.stateful. So when you use database.stateful, what you will be able to do, you will be then able to define variables. Again, those cannot be static variables, but yeah, you can define variables like this one, which will maintain its value across batches, right? So if you look into this particular example, so we have this particular variable defined, summarize account total, and we keep on adding the values here, right? the summary, we keep on adding the values of it here, right? So after every execution, the value keeps on adding to this. So first execution, let's say the value becomes 5. The next execution, it will be 5 plus 5 is equal to 10. The next execution, it will be 10 plus 5 is equal to 15, right? So if you need this kind of feature or functionality, or if you need variables which will maintain its value across all batches, then you will have to implement database.stateful. That is going to be required. Now, let's understand some key limitations. So we have spoken about the key concepts around batch apex. Now let's quickly understand some of the key limitations in batch apex. All right, there are a lot of limitations, a lot of considerations, but again, I will not try and overload you with a lot of information right here, but some key things which we need to understand or need to keep in mind. So first thing, up to 5 batch jobs are permitted to be queued, or those can be active concurrently. So up to 5 batch jobs. As I said, batch jobs are expected to be working with bigger chunks of data. So Salesforce has a strict limitation of up to 5 batch jobs can be queued. So in the queue, there can be 5 batch jobs or active 5 batch jobs. Total should be 5. Now there is something called Apex Flex Queue. Now what does this Apex Flex Queue do? If you have enabled Apex Flex Queue can hold 100 jobs in addition to the 5 jobs which can be queued. 100 batch jobs can be in the holding stage. All right. So if you have put something, if you have, let's say, put 10 batch jobs into the queue, if you try to put 10 into the job into the Apex queue, then 5 will get into the queue and 5 will get into the Flex queue with the status as holding. Okay, so they once these are cleared, first in first out basis, once these are cleared, then these will start getting here. Okay, you will have the option in the Apex Flex queue. You can at any point of time, till the time the jobs are still holding in the Flex queue, you will have the option to go and reorder those. So that is something which you can do. All right. Now, so up to 100 holding jobs can be there. So there are 5 batch jobs can be queued. Up to 100 holding batch jobs can be held in the Apex Flex queue. The maximum number of batch Apex methods execution in 24-hour period is 250,000 or number of licenses multiplied by 200, whichever is greater. So whatever is greater out of this or this, that is the number of maximum batch Apex methods which can be executed, right? So, as I said, there will be multiple executions, etc. So there is a limitation on this also. Then up to 50 million records can be returned in the Database.QueryLocator object. So when we were working, or when we have the option of defining the scope using Database.QueryLocator, the overall scope size for your using Database.QueryLocator cannot exceed 50 million. So there is a limit here also, but 50 million is considerably a huge limit, right? So ideally we should not be hitting that limit, but yeah, there is a limit there as well. Okay. And then the start, execute, and finish methods can implement up to 100 callouts each. So each method can implement up to 100 callouts. So these are some of the key limitations, or high level limitations which you need to definitely be aware of. In addition to this, there are more limitations or considerations while working with batch Apex. So I hope we have got overall understanding of batch Apex and the key concepts around it. As I said, in future sessions we'll try to see some demo. We will also talk about some key interview questions, and we will see if we can also discuss about some real use cases of batch Apex. In case there are any specific questions or doubts that you have, or anything that you want me to specifically elaborate or discuss more, please feel free to share that through comments or DM.